Picture this. You're standing on the edge of a massive lake in 1450, watching farmers walking on water. Except they're not performing miracles. They're tending crops on floating gardens that somehow produce more food per square foot than modern industrial farms. Welcome to the world of Aztec Chinampas, the agricultural innovation that turned a swampy lake into the breadbasket of an empire. Most people think the Aztecs were all about human sacrifice and gold-hungry conquistadors, but here's what your history teacher probably never told you. These guys were agricultural geniuses who figured out how to feed a city of 200,000 people using nothing but mud, reeds, and some seriously clever engineering. We're talking about a farming system so efficient that it makes today's vertical farms look like amateur hour. The numbers alone will blow your mind. A single Chinampa could produce 7 harvests per year, while most European farmers were lucky to get 1 decent crop. That's not a typo. 7 harvests from the same plot of land in 12 months. The Aztecs basically invented sustainable agriculture 5 centuries before anyone even knew what sustainability meant. But here's where it gets really wild. These floating gardens weren't actually floating. That's the first misconception we need to clear up. Calling them floating fields is like calling a skyscraper a really tall tent. Technically, it's reaching for the sky, but you're missing the whole engineering marvel underneath. These Chinampas were anchored agricultural islands built in shallow lakes, and the construction process was more complex than building a modern highway. Let me paint you a picture of Lake Texcoco in its prime. Imagine a body of water roughly the size of Lake Tahoe, but shallow, maybe 6 feet deep in most places. Now imagine that lake dotted with thousands of rectangular garden plots, each one perfectly positioned between narrow canals that look like a giant green checkerboard from above. Spanish conquistadors described it as one of the most beautiful sights they'd ever seen, and these were guys who'd traveled halfway around the world. The whole system started with something deceptively simple: stakes in the mud. But don't let that fool you. The Aztecs had turned stake driving into an art form. They knew exactly how deep to drive each wooden post, what angle would provide the best stability, and how to space them for maximum structural integrity. A typical Chinampa measured about 300 feet long and 15 feet wide, roughly the size of a football field cut into thin strips. Here's where the real magic happened. Once they had their rectangular frame staked out in the shallow water, workers would start weaving walls made from reeds and brush. Think of it like making the world's largest basket, except this basket was going to hold tons of soil and support crops for decades. The weaving technique they used was so tight that it could hold back water pressure while still allowing just enough seepage for irrigation. The material they chose for these walls wasn't random either. Tule reeds were perfect because they were lightweight when dry, but became incredibly strong when wet. Plus, they were basically free. Lake Texcoco was full of them. These reeds had another secret superpower. They naturally resisted rot when constantly wet, which meant Chinampa walls could last for years without major repairs. But building the walls was just the beginning. The real backbreaking work came next, filling these floating baskets with enough soil to create farmland. And we're not talking about just any soil. The Aztecs had figured out the perfect recipe for agricultural success, and it involved more ingredients than your grandmother's secret sauce. The foundation layer started with whatever organic matter they could find: dead reeds, fallen leaves, kitchen scraps, even human waste. Everything went into the mix. The Aztecs were recycling champions before recycling was cool. They understood that decomposing organic matter would create the kind of rich, fertile soil that makes plants practically jump out of the ground. Then came the secret ingredient: lake mud. Not just any mud, mind you, but the nutrient-rich sludge from the bottom of Lake Texcoco. This stuff was like agricultural gold, packed with minerals and organic matter that had been accumulating for centuries. Workers would wade into the lake with baskets, scooping up this black gold and hauling it back to the Chinampas. The layering process was more precise than making a wedding cake. First, a thick layer of reeds and organic matter for drainage and structure, then alternating layers of mud and more organic material, building up the soil level inch by careful inch. The goal was to raise the growing surface about 3 feet above the high water mark, high enough to prevent flooding, but low enough for the roots to reach groundwater. Here's what made this system absolutely brilliant. The soil stayed perpetually moist through capillary action. Water from the surrounding canals would seep up through the soil layers, creating perfect growing conditions without any need for irrigation systems. It was like having a self-watering garden that never ran dry, even during the driest months. But the Aztecs weren't done being clever. Along the edges of each Chinampa, they planted willow trees called ahuejotes. These weren't just for decoration. They were living infrastructure. The willow roots would grow deep into the Chinampa structure, binding everything together like natural rebar. Within a few years, these trees created a living retaining wall that was stronger than anything built from stone or wood. The spacing between Chinampas was calculated with mathematical precision. Each canal was exactly wide enough for a canoe to pass through, about 8 feet, but narrow enough to maximize the amount of growing space. This created a transportation network that put modern city planning to shame. You could paddle from any Chinampa directly to the markets of Tenochtitlan without ever touching dry land. The canals served multiple purposes beyond transportation. They were the irrigation system, the drainage system, and the highway system all rolled into one. During dry seasons, farmers could flood their Chinampas by breaking small gaps in the canal walls. During wet seasons, excess water would drain back into the canals automatically. It was like having a smart irrigation system 5 centuries before smart anything existed. Water management was crucial because Lake Texcoco wasn't exactly a paradise. Parts of the lake were brackish, too salty for most crops. But the Aztecs figured out how to use freshwater springs and rainfall to maintain the right salinity levels in their canal system. They built small dams and channels to direct fresh water where it was needed most, creating microclimates within the larger lake ecosystem. The construction process took months of backbreaking labor, but once a Chinampa was established, it became a food production machine that could operate for decades. The key was understanding that this wasn't just farming, it was ecosystem engineering on a massive scale. Every element worked together: the water, the soil, the plants, even the fish that lived in the canals. Speaking of fish, the Aztecs had figured out aquaculture too. The canals weren't just transportation routes, they were fish farms. Species like carp and catfish thrived in the canal system, providing protein to complement the vegetables grown on the Chinampas. Fish waste fertilized the water, which in turn fertilized the crops through the capillary irrigation system. The whole thing was so well designed that maintenance was surprisingly minimal. The biggest job was periodic dredging, scooping fresh mud from the canal bottoms to replenish the soil on the Chinampas. This wasn't just maintenance, it was improvement. Each layer of fresh mud added more nutrients and kept the soil from becoming depleted. But building these agricultural marvels was only half the story. The real genius of the Chinampa system revealed itself when it came time to actually grow food. And that's where things get really interesting. The seed preparation alone would make modern gardeners weep with envy. Aztec farmers didn't just throw seeds into the ground and hope for the best. They treated each seed like a precious gem that deserved the royal treatment. The process started with something called almaquigo, specialized seedbeds that were basically plant nurseries on steroids. These seedbeds were small rectangular plots, usually about 6 feet by 3 feet, built right on the Chinampa, using the finest soil mixture they could create. Think of it as the agricultural equivalent of a 5-star hotel. Only the best accommodations for baby plants. The soil in these seed beds was so finely prepared that it looked more like potting mix than regular dirt. They'd sift it through woven baskets to remove any chunks or debris, then mix in the perfect ratio of decomposed organic matter. The timing of seed planting was more precise than a Swiss watch. Aztec farmers had figured out lunar cycles, seasonal patterns, and weather predictions that would make modern meteorologists jealous. They knew exactly when to plant each crop to maximize growing seasons and avoid the worst weather. A typical farmer would have seedbeds going year-round, with new plantings starting every few weeks. Here's where it gets fascinating. They practiced companion planting on a level that modern permaculture experts are still trying to figure out. The famous three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, were just the beginning. Aztec farmers would plant up to 8 different crops on a single chinampa, each one carefully positioned to help its neighbors thrive. Corn stalks provided natural trellises for beans, which fixed nitrogen in the soil for heavy-feeding crops. Squash leaves created living mulch that retained moisture and suppressed weeds. Amaranth grew tall enough to provide windbreak protection. Tomatoes and chilies added pest control through their natural compounds. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance where every plant knew its role. The transplanting process was where Aztec farmers really showed their skills. Once seedlings reached the right size, usually about 4 inches tall, they'd carefully dig them up with specialized wooden tools that looked like tiny shovels. Each seedling was transplanted with its own ball of soil, minimizing root shock and ensuring healthy growth. But here's the part that would blow your mind. They could transplant seedlings year-round because the Chinampa system provided perfect growing conditions regardless of season. While European farmers were stuck waiting for spring, Aztec farmers were harvesting lettuce in December and planting tomatoes in February. The constant moisture and nutrient supply meant growing seasons basically didn't exist. The planting patterns were mathematical masterpieces. Rows were spaced exactly the right distance apart to maximize sunlight exposure, while minimizing competition between plants. Taller crops were planted on the north side of each chinampa to avoid shading shorter plants. Fast-growing crops like greens were interplanted between slower crops like corn, allowing farmers to harvest multiple times from the same space. Crop rotation wasn't just a good idea, it was a precise science. Aztec farmers had figured out which crops depleted which nutrients and planned their rotations accordingly. After harvesting nitrogen-hungry corn, they'd plant nitrogen-fixing beans. After beans, they'd plant leafy greens that thrived in nitrogen-rich soil. The cycle continued year after year, keeping the soil healthy and productive. The maintenance routines were like clockwork. Every morning, farmers would paddle their canoes through the canal system, checking each chinampa for problems. Weeds were pulled by hand before they could establish themselves. Diseased plants were removed immediately to prevent spreading. Soil moisture was checked by sticking fingers deep into the growing beds. Pest control was handled through a combination of techniques that would make organic farmers proud. Flooding was their secret weapon. When insect populations got out of hand, farmers would temporarily flood the chinampas, drowning the pests while giving the crops a drink. Ducks were released into the canals to eat mosquito larvae and other unwanted insects. Beneficial insects were encouraged through diverse plantings. The dredging cycles were timed to coincide with crop rotations. When a section of chinampa was between plantings, that's when fresh mud would be added. Workers would wade into the canals with specialized baskets, scooping up the nutrient-rich sediment that had accumulated on the bottom. This mud wasn't just fertilizer. It was a complete soil amendment that added organic matter, minerals, and beneficial microorganisms. Water management required constant attention. Small wooden sluices controlled water flow between different sections of the canal system. Trash racks prevented debris from clogging narrow passages. During heavy rains, excess water was channeled away from growing areas. During dry spells, water was conserved and distributed where it was needed most. The logistics of harvest day were more complex than running a modern distribution center. Pre-dawn preparation started with checking which crops were ready for picking. Experienced farmers could tell at a glance which tomatoes were perfectly ripe, which greens were at peak tenderness, and which flowers would last longest in the market. Loading the canoes was an art form in itself. Delicate crops went on top, sturdy vegetables on the bottom. Everything was arranged to prevent bruising during the paddle to market. A single canoe could carry up to 2,000 pounds of fresh produce. That's equivalent to a modern pickup truck, except this truck floated and never needed gas. The paddle to market took advantage of an interconnected canal system that stretched for miles. Farmers could travel from the most remote Chinampas to the heart of Tenochtitlan without ever leaving their canoes. The main canals were like highways, with smaller channels branching off to individual farming areas. Traffic flowed both ways. Empty canoes heading out to the fields, loaded canoes heading to market. Market timing was everything. The best prices went to farmers who arrived first with the freshest produce. Competition was fierce, but so was cooperation. Farmers who specialized in different crops would often coordinate their arrival times to avoid flooding the market with identical products. A successful market day could provide enough income to support a farming family for a week. The whole system operated on trust and reputation. Regular customers knew which farmers produced the highest quality crops and would seek them out specifically. Word-of-mouth recommendations could make or break a farming operation. The most successful farmers built loyal customer bases that would buy their entire harvest before it even reached the general market. The economics of Chinampa farming would make modern business schools jealous. Think about it. No rent, no mortgage payments, and your office literally grew its own food. But building that economic success required more planning than launching a space mission. Every square inch of growing space had to earn its keep, and farmers calculated their returns with the precision of Wall Street traders. A typical Chinampa generated income from at least 4 different sources simultaneously. The main crops provided the bulk of the revenue, but farmers also sold cut flowers, medicinal herbs, and even the fish that lived in their canals. It was like running 4 businesses from the same location, except your location happened to be floating on a lake and required 0 commute time. The profit margins were absolutely insane by medieval standards. European farmers were lucky to feed their own families, plus maybe 1 or 2 others. Aztec Chinampa farmers could support dozens of people from a single plot. One successful farmer could generate enough surplus to trade for luxury goods, pay taxes to the empire, and still have enough left over to expand his operation. But the real genius wasn't just in the production, it was in the supply chain management. While European merchants were struggling to transport grain across muddy roads with ox carts, Aztec farmers had a transportation network that would make Amazon jealous. Canoes moved faster than carts, carried more weight, and never got stuck in the mud or broke down from overuse. The seasonal planning was more complex than running a restaurant chain. Farmers had to coordinate planting schedules across multiple crops, predict market demand months in advance, and manage labor requirements during peak harvest periods. They tracked which varieties sold best in which seasons, adjusted their planting ratios accordingly, and even experimented with new crops to stay ahead of the competition. Quality control started in the seed beds and never stopped. Farmers inspected their crops daily, removing any plants that showed signs of disease or pest damage. Only the perfect specimens made it to market, which meant Aztec consumers enjoyed vegetables that would be considered premium quality by today's standards. The rejected produce didn't go to waste, though. It was composted back into the system or fed to the ducks and fish. The storage and preservation techniques were surprisingly sophisticated. Farmers knew exactly how to harvest each crop for maximum shelf life. Corn was picked at the perfect moisture content for long-term storage. Beans were dried using specific techniques that prevented mold and insect damage. Even delicate crops like tomatoes were handled with methods that extended their market life by days or weeks. Seed saving was both an art and a science. The best farmers maintained their own seed stocks, selecting only the most productive plants for breeding purposes. Over generations, they developed varieties perfectly adapted to Chinampa conditions, plants that thrived in high moisture, rich soil, and intensive cultivation methods. These weren't your average vegetables. They were super crops, bred for specific growing conditions. The social networks among farmers were as important as the physical canal networks. Information traveled fast through the Chinampa community. If someone discovered a new pest control technique or developed a particularly productive plant variety, the knowledge spread quickly. Farmers shared resources, traded seeds, and even coordinated their harvest schedules to avoid market gluts. Training the next generation wasn't left to chance. Young farmers learned by working alongside experienced growers, absorbing decades of accumulated knowledge. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when crops were ready, how to judge soil moisture by feel, and how to predict weather patterns by observing cloud formations and bird behavior. The seasonal rhythms created a calendar that revolved entirely around farming activities. Spring wasn't just a season, it was dredging time, when fresh mud was added to replenish soil nutrients. Summer meant intensive planting and harvesting rotations. Fall was seed collection season, when the best specimens were selected for next year's crops. Winter brought maintenance activities and planning for the following year. Weather prediction was crucial for success, and Aztec farmers developed forecasting skills that were remarkably accurate. They watched cloud patterns, wind directions, and animal behavior to predict rainfall, storms, and temperature changes. A farmer who could accurately predict a late frost could save his entire crop by harvesting early or providing protection. The tool maintenance was as important as crop maintenance. Wooden digging sticks were carefully shaped and resharpened. Baskets were rewoven when they showed signs of wear. Canoes were regularly sealed and repaired to prevent leaks. A broken tool during harvest season could mean the difference between profit and disaster. Record keeping was done through a combination of memory, physical markers, and simple counting systems. Successful farmers tracked which sections of their Chinampas performed best, which crop varieties yielded the most, and which planting times produced the highest quality harvests. This information guided future decisions and helped optimize production year after year. The competition between farmers drove constant innovation. Everyone was looking for ways to grow crops faster, yield more per square foot, or develop varieties that commanded premium prices. Some farmers specialized in exotic crops that few others could grow successfully. Others focused on producing the most consistent, reliable harvests that buyers could count on. Disease prevention required constant vigilance and quick action. Farmers learned to recognize the early signs of plant diseases and had specific protocols for dealing with each type of problem. Infected plants were removed immediately and burned to prevent spreading. Soil treatments using various organic materials helped prevent recurring problems. The relationship between farmers and their regular customers was built on trust and mutual benefit. Steady customers provided guaranteed income and advance orders, while farmers provided consistent quality and reliable delivery. These relationships often lasted for generations, with farming families supplying the same merchant families for decades. Labor management during peak seasons required coordination that would impress modern project managers. Harvest times for different crops overlapped, creating periods when every available person was needed. Families worked together, neighbors helped each other, and temporary workers were hired for the busiest periods. Everyone knew their role, and timing was everything. The waste management was incredibly efficient by any standard. Nothing was thrown away or allowed to rot uselessly. Crop residues were composted, fish waste fertilized the water, and even human waste was incorporated into the nutrient cycle. It was a completely closed-loop system, where waste from one part of the operation became inputs for another part. Market intelligence was gathered through networks of farmers, merchants, and customers. Successful farmers knew which crops were in short supply, which ones were oversupplied, and how to adjust their production accordingly. They tracked price fluctuations, seasonal demand patterns, and even the preferences of individual large customers. The infrastructure maintenance never stopped. Canals needed regular cleaning to prevent silting and blockages. Chinampa edges required reinforcement where erosion occurred. Water control structures needed adjustment as conditions changed. It was like maintaining a city, except the city was made of mud, reeds, and water. Risk management involved diversification strategies that modern investors would recognize. No farmer relied on a single crop or single market. Multiple varieties, multiple harvest times, and multiple sales channels protected against disasters that could wipe out less diversified operations. Smart farmers always had backup plans for their backup plans. The success of individual farmers contributed to the success of the entire system, creating a feedback loop that made everyone more prosperous. Better techniques discovered by one farmer eventually spread to others. More productive Chinampas meant more food in the markets, which supported larger populations, which created more demand for Chinampa products. Everyone benefited when the system worked well. The innovation didn't stop with individual success stories, though. The whole Chinampa network was basically a giant research and development lab where thousands of farmers were constantly experimenting with new techniques. What worked on one plot got tested on dozens of others within weeks. What failed spectacularly became cautionary tales that saved other farmers from making the same mistakes. It was like having an agricultural internet made of canoes and conversations. The seasonal workforce dynamics were more complex than managing a modern corporation. Peak planting season required different skills than harvest time, which needed different people than maintenance season. Some workers specialized in the backbreaking job of mud dredging. These guys developed forearms like tree trunks and could move tons of sediment in a single day. Others became expert transplant specialists who could move seedlings with surgical precision. Then there were the canal cleaners, probably the least glamorous but most essential workers in the system. These folks spent their days clearing debris, maintaining water flow, and making sure the transportation network kept running smoothly. Without them, the entire system would have ground to a halt faster than a canoe with a hole in the bottom. They were like the highway maintenance crews of the ancient world, except their highways were made of water, and their tools were basically fancy fishing nets. The specialized tool making became its own industry. Different tasks required different implements, and craftsmen developed expertise in creating exactly the right tool for each job. Transplanting tools had to be sharp enough to cut cleanly through soil, but gentle enough not to damage delicate roots. Mud dredging baskets needed to be strong enough to hold heavy sediment, but light enough for workers to lift repeatedly. Even the paddles for canoes were designed specifically for navigating narrow canals loaded with cargo. Quality testing was built into every step of the process. Farmers didn't just assume their techniques were working, they compared results constantly. If one section of a Chinampa consistently outproduced another, they'd analyze every variable until they figured out why. Soil composition, water depth, plant spacing, harvest timing, everything was subject to continuous improvement through trial and error. The knowledge transfer system was more sophisticated than most modern corporations manage. Experienced farmers didn't jealously guard their secrets. They actively taught younger workers, because everyone understood that a more skilled workforce benefited everyone. Master farmers took apprentices who would spend years learning not just the techniques, but the reasoning behind each decision. It wasn't enough to know how to do something. You had to understand why it worked. The crop breeding programs that emerged from this system were incredibly advanced for their time. Farmers weren't just growing whatever seeds they happened to have. They were actively selecting for traits that improved yield, flavor, disease resistance, and storage life. Over generations, they developed varieties that were perfectly adapted to Chinampa conditions. Some of these plants were so specialized that they couldn't grow well anywhere else. They'd evolved to thrive in the unique environment of high moisture, rich soil, and intensive cultivation. Weather adaptation strategies went far beyond just watching the sky. Farmers developed specific protocols for different weather emergencies. Sudden temperature drops required immediate harvesting of sensitive crops. Extended dry periods meant adjusting water management to conserve moisture. Heavy storms called for protecting delicate plants and managing excess water runoff. Each situation had proven responses that minimized damage and maximized recovery. The economic planning horizon extended much further than most people realize. Successful farmers weren't just thinking about this season's crops, they were planning improvements that would pay off years in the future. Expanding a Chinampa, developing new crop varieties, or building better infrastructure required investments that might not show returns for multiple growing seasons. It took remarkable foresight and financial discipline to make these long-term decisions pay off. The supply chain optimization was more complex than modern logistics companies handle. Farmers had to coordinate harvesting schedules across multiple crops, arrange transportation capacity for peak delivery periods, and time their market arrivals to maximize prices. A miscalculation could mean arriving at market with a canoe full of wilted vegetables that nobody wanted to buy. Getting it right meant arriving with fresh produce just as demand peaked. The customer relationship management would impress modern sales professionals. Top farmers knew their regular customers personally, what they liked to buy, when they needed it, how much they typically ordered, and what prices they were willing to pay. These relationships often included informal credit arrangements, advance orders for special occasions, and even custom growing of specific varieties that particular customers preferred. The productivity metrics that emerge from this system are still impressive by today's standards. While European farmers were getting maybe 400 pounds of grain per acre per year, Chinampa farmers were producing over 6,000 pounds of mixed vegetables from the same area. That's not just a little better, that's 15 times more productive. Even modern industrial agriculture struggles to match those numbers when you factor in the sustainability and resource efficiency. The environmental monitoring was surprisingly sophisticated for a pre-scientific culture. Farmers tracked indicators that told them about soil health, water quality, pest populations, and plant diseases. They knew which birds indicated healthy ecosystems, which insects meant trouble was coming, and which water conditions supported the best crop growth. This wasn't just folklore. It was practical environmental science developed through generations of careful observation. The community cooperation extended beyond just sharing knowledge. During emergencies, farmers would pool resources to help each other recover from disasters. If a storm damaged someone's Chinampa, neighbors would contribute labor and materials for repairs. If pests attacked one area, farmers would coordinate response efforts across multiple plots. The entire community understood that individual success was linked to collective success. The inventory management systems were more sophisticated than most modern small businesses use. Farmers tracked not just how much they had of each crop, but also the quality grades, harvest dates, and expected shelf life. They knew exactly which products needed to be sold first, which ones could be stored longer, and which ones were best for different types of customers. Running out of popular items meant lost revenue, but overproducing meant spoilage and waste. The transportation scheduling was like running a delivery company with boats instead of trucks. Farmers coordinated their trips to market to maximize efficiency and minimize conflicts. Heavy cargo went in sturdy canoes, delicate produce in specialized vessels, and multiple farmers would often coordinate their schedules to share transportation costs or provide mutual assistance during the journey. The competitive intelligence gathering was remarkably organized for a supposedly primitive society. Farmers kept track of what their competitors were growing, when they harvested, what prices they got, and how their techniques compared. This information helped everyone make better decisions about what to plant, when to harvest, and how to price their products. Competition was fierce, but it was also respectful and based on innovation rather than underhanded tactics. The seasonal labor allocation required planning skills that would challenge modern project managers. Different crops had different labor requirements at different times of year. Corn needed intensive planting attention, but minimal maintenance until harvest. Leafy greens required constant attention but could be harvested continuously. Flowers needed careful timing and gentle handling, but commanded premium prices. Coordinating all these requirements across multiple crops meant farmers were essentially running complex scheduling operations in their heads. The financial planning went far beyond simple profit and loss calculations. Successful farmers understood concepts like cash flow timing, seasonal price fluctuations, and investment payback periods. They knew when to reinvest profits in expansion, when to save for lean periods, and when to diversify into new crops or markets. Some even engaged in what we'd recognize today as futures trading, agreeing to deliver specific quantities of crops at predetermined prices months in advance. But all this sophisticated agriculture was just the foundation for something even more impressive: a food distribution system that kept the largest city in the Americas fed year-round without a single truck, warehouse, or refrigeration unit. So there you have it, the most sophisticated agricultural system the world had ever seen, built with nothing but mud, reeds, and human ingenuity. Those Aztec farmers weren't just growing food, they were running a precision operation that would make modern agribusiness executives weep with envy. 7 harvests per year, 0 fossil fuels, and enough surplus to feed an empire while maintaining perfect ecological balance. The numbers don't lie. 6,000 pounds of food per acre compared to Europe's 400. Transportation networks moved faster than ox carts. Supply chains delivered fresh produce daily to 250,000 people. They did it all while improving their environment instead of destroying it. We're still trying to figure out how to do what they perfected centuries ago.